The first question we have to establish, does God exist?
Yes.
Simple as
Yes.
that. Do we have free will?
Yes, we do.
God is real, angels are real, demons are real. Is the devil real?
Oh, yes. Yes. Well, it has to be.
But will I go to either heaven or hell?
You will persist after you die.
You're confident of that?
As we've just seen, Chris Langan is very confident about many of life's ultimate questions. So today I want to check out his book, fittingly titled The Art of Knowing, to understand where in his thinking he gets all that confidence from, because this is very often not really based in anything. For example, the incredibly high IQ score that he originally became famous for was based on a test in a popular science magazine that was just completely invalid in the way it was administered, without a meaningful time limit or ways to control for people using various tools to help them answer the questions. And while he has since apparently done well at another test, that being the WAIS 3 given in the context of a TV segment, it has a much humbler range of reliably measurable IQ scores than what he originally claimed for himself. He's also been known for, and I'm not saying this lightly, sharing incredibly racist and conspiratorial posts on his social media that further bring his judgment into question. Constantly comparing people of color to animals, for example, or at one point seemingly insinuating that George Bush may have staged 9/11 in order to distract everyone from Chris's quote-unquote world-changing theory of the universe that he had published before. So, to the extent that he is intelligent in the most technical sense of the word, it really seems to be more of an example of the phrase that the smarter you are, the better you become at fooling yourself. An idea that, while I don't want to overgeneralize it, will be giving us food for thought throughout. But before we jump in, I have to be honest, I didn't just choose this book as a study on ego-driven overconfidence. When I saw the title of its chapters and its placement within this niche of casual philosophy essays that I used to really enjoy, I was genuinely like, damn, I might actually enjoy this shit. So I actually want to give this book a fair shot. And well, if I like it, I'm gonna have to reflect on what that means when the review is over. Looking at the chapters, I was originally quite intrigued by the freedom topic from the subtitle. There are books in this niche that cover freedom in a way that is very existential and relatable to everyday life, I find. But I realized pretty soon that this is not that. Instead, he's more into actually proving the freedom of will, which in turn, I don't find that promising. On first glance, though, he does reasonably well in the early chapters to acknowledge that science so far can't really prove or disprove free will. Yeah, I think it's more of a fuzzy interpretation than a data point. But he's definitely losing me when in his final chapter on the topic, he all of a sudden derives a great deal of certainty about the question by presupposing that the universe must be purposeful and that therefore it has to support meaningful volition. And I'm reading this and I'm constantly going wait, this doesn't follow from that. Where has he got that from? I think his reasoning style is quite telling for what we're trying to explore here. One thing that makes it so irritating, I think, is that after describing two of the main positions on free will, determinism and indeterminism, you would expect a counter-argument against them before moving on and embracing his alternative view. But especially with determinism, the main competitor, there just straight up isn't one. There's one snide remark he left in the bracket here, and at another point he derives an implication of it which isn't a given and wouldn't constitute a rebuttal even if it was. But I guess he just doesn't vibe with it, because then he introduces his preferred option as if he had now shown the others to be unsatisfactory. It's a version of free will liberalism, the idea that we have free will pretty much. And what follows genuinely reads like him going, okay, this sounds good, how could I make that fit with my worldview? It could be possible if the world was like this, and that would imply that. With the underlying assumption, I guess, being that if he can construct a coherent-sounding metaphysical system around his option, he somehow proved that it now must be the case. But meanwhile, as I said, he completely tossed aside the main competing view without an argument, really. And aren't these ongoing philosophical problems called difficult, partly because you can create coherent-sounding worldviews around either of the options if you actually tried? Later, I think he realizes that he put a bunch of stuff aside, so he makes a point in going back to at least a small section of what he bracketed out, the idea that the universe is random, and quite tellingly he addresses it with what reads like a run-of-the-mill Christian apologetic argument from fine-tuning, that things can't be uncaused because they appear so well-structured, when of course with evolution there's a very prominent theory about how order can emerge from randomness without having to assume agentic control over it, as he seems to be doing. Which leads me to the first key takeaway from this book. I didn't know just how much of Langan's worldview is tied up in those religious sentiments. To be honest, with all the physics and philosophy terms he throws around, I really thought he would be more quasi-scientific, secularish in his approach. But I think Josh from the Mile High podcast puts quite well what the more fitting place for Langan's type of language would be.
I like how all of a sudden Mikey from the Daily Wire goes into the whole biblical, creation story basically. And Chris is like, oh yeah, basically, yeah, that's what it is. Blah, blah. And I'm like, so why not just be a preacher then?
Right.
If that's ultimately your philosophy ultimately agrees with the biblical version of creation, what's the point of all this then? Why are you then confusing everybody with all this other stuff when that's ultimately the simplified version of what your whole life's work is about, proving the existence of God?
And I could substantiate his heavily religious sentiments with so many clips from his channel, but maybe the following should suffice to show just how deeply he is into all of this.
You have to understand is that when an atheist becomes an activist and denies God, those people have no chance of being good.
Right, of course.
Those are blasphemers and, of course, destined for eternal damnation. So, whenever you can, you should try to sort of nudge them in that direction. If they're the kind of people that are just going to melt down, however, and go into a demonic frenzy, if you give them the slightest nudge in that direction, then maybe you just better kick them to the curb. I don't care whether they're in your family or not. So maybe they need to be shocked out of that decision.
Quite something, eh? So in terms of his reasoning, the longer you read him, the more obvious it becomes how many premises are derived from his religious views. And how it's exactly those premises that really set up the groundwork for the often circular conclusions he reaches. I think this tendency becomes even more blatantly transparent when we look at his next essay called On the Perils of Metaphysical Sky Surfing Without a Parachute, wherein he bemoans that scientific discoveries have kind of put into question humanity's special place as the crown of creation that came historically more natural to us, saying, I think quite reasonably, that, for example, studies on the brain and intelligence of animals would suggest that the difference between humans and other beings maybe from a certain viewpoint more of a quantitative sort, a matter of more neocortex than of a fundamentally metaphysical type, which he says is a big problem because this ethos of being special is what justified us polluting, using up resources and extinguishing other species. So, after having pointed to some real issues with this view of human exceptionalism, in a paragraph that I think gives quite a remarkable insight into a certain brand of religious conservative thinking, instead of reconsidering that way of thinking about humanity, he reaffirms the absolute importance of his traditional way of thinking about it, saying it is absolutely essential to our collective self-importance. It cannot be a quirk of faith and must be based on metaphysical distinctiveness. And then goes on to pose the very telling question. So, where will we go now at the dawn of the new millennium for renewed confirmation of our specialness in the scheme of things? A question that is really worth keeping on screen for a bit, because it spells out so many things that are worth criticizing about Langan's style of thinking, if he was really intending to reach some intersubjectively valid conclusions here. It's a question that explicitly searches in a direction that would allow to confirm a previously held comforting belief based on a religious sentiment, while basically disregarding a proper exploration of alternative. For real, like, if you look at a question like this, would it surprise you at all that he reached those very simple yes or no answers about the spiritual questions from the start? I think I can totally see how he got there now. Say you think about the devil, right? And you start your exploration being like, what would the modern day equivalent of the devil be? Are the banksters and the evildoers, of course. And next time someone asks you, do you think the devil exists? You're gonna be like, well, of course he does. Look at all the banksters and the evildoers. Who do they serve?
I've got my superior, and then I'm looking up farther. Now I see the director of the CIA. Who's giving that guy his orders?
Let's watch this clip a bit longer, because we're gonna talk later about how people with deeply held spiritual beliefs may look past some of Langan's red flags because of how what he says seems to confirm those views. And Michael Knowles just presents an absolutely perfect example of that here.
As far as most of these guys are concerned, it could be the devil himself that's running things.
It's so amazing that you say that, because it takes it full circle to the point that when I hear, okay, this so-and-so is actually
really beholden to so-and-so, and this person is actually beholden to this person, but then eventually saying so-and-so, if in a really powerful position, they're actually responsible to so-and-so and accountable to, and you think, okay.
At a certain point you think, I don't know, I have no way of verifying this could be it. And then when you go all the way back to, and so-and-so is really just answering to the devil, now you've got me again. Because I read that in my Bible. I know that that's true.
And here's the thing, if it was just a personal or preachery reflection, the banksters are maybe a bad example though, I'd say there's nothing in principle wrong with that. Because with these worldviews, we're all just kind of trying to find something that gives us some meaning and direction, I think. And if motivated reasoning is part of that, so be it, right? To a certain extent, we're all just human. But the issue, of course, is how he misrepresents science, trying to derive this false sense of authority from it. How he literally equates it with theology and contributes to misinformation by trying to give his worldview this veneer of objectivity. And also just independently from the methodology he uses, how his worldview ends up being filled with what we have seen in the tweets from the start, in my opinion, absolutely unacceptable levels of intolerance towards other groups of people. So with regards to our core question, I guess, of how intelligent people can reach unreasonable levels of confidence, maybe you noticed that I was kind of on track to blame religion in this section, and it certainly lacks inherent safeguards against these biases that more concrete fields like, carpentry would have. But there's still plenty of critical thinkers who are also religious. So as we will continue to analyze more of these texts, I think we may see that religion is really not at the heart of the issue with people like Chris Langan at all. Instead, I think his hyper-associative and overconfident thinking could be triggered just as much by the combination of science and science fiction, as is the case in the aforementioned Omni magazine, or just by the inherent ambiguity of hearing about public events in the media. So I truly believe that people like Chris, unless they seek support, will always struggle to draw appropriate distinctions between concepts, facts and values in pretty much any topics where abstractness, ambiguity and ego motivations are involved. And I think irrespectively of what you may think of him specifically, there's something sad about that as well. So this is the moment where I should make the disclaimer that any psychological assessments I'm making in this video are purely my own opinions. And while I have a degree in psychology, I'm not qualified in giving any clinical assessment here, nor is it really what I'm interested in doing in the first place. And while we're already doing disclaimers, I feel like it's also worth pointing out that multiple times in this video I kind of fly past the more agreeable sections of Langan's text with phrases like, he does reasonably well to describe X or Y. And when I do that, you should generally assume that I'm glossing over at least some inaccuracies along the way, as I'm not primarily interested in fact-checking every single claim here. In this essay, for example, while making the generally apt problem description, Langan pretty severely overstates multiple scientific claims. For example, when he concludes from a study where lab mice have been bred for a certain brain protein, that quote-unquote, it is narrowing the IQ gap between humans and rodents. The study was from 1999, by the way. Or when saying that certain smart drugs are expected to cause IQ spikes of 50 points, which, again, while based on real studies, sounds tellingly similar to the more science fiction articles in the Omni magazine, rather than measured scientific prognoses. But okay, I already engaged with this section way more than I originally wanted to. Like, this was not an enjoyable read so far. The essay title that spoke to me most actually was this one. In ethics, not everything is relative. But again, there's already a couple of things right in the introduction that would make me skip this one as well if I was truly reviewing it like something I was reading for enjoyment. Firstly, there's this American pathos to it that already kind of turned me off from it as a European. Though I definitely want to cut him some slack on that, being that it's written not too long after the 9/11 attacks. My real criticism starts with how he sets up the core question, saying that the events of 9/11 are a good opportunity to discuss ethics and moral relativism. And then goes on like this, quote, was the World Trade Center disaster morally wrong? Question mark. In the US, most people would say yes, but if one were on the streets of an enemy nation, the answers might be very different. So this to me is not a very promising start for a philosophical discussion. I think by using this incredibly black and white example, he sets himself up to attack a very strawman-y, uninteresting version of moral relativism that the fewest people, never mind any of his readers, would actually subscribe to. Like, I'm not a fan of moral relativism either, just to be clear, but there are at least interesting nuances to discuss here. I think for many of us, for example, it's kind of just a matter of degree from things where we go, okay, this is just a different culture doing its thing that may be justifiable within their own context and history, to things that are clearly contemptible irrespectively of that. Coincidentally though, matters of degree and overlap exactly represent two modes of thought that really don't seem to be part of Chris's mental vocabulary when discussing positions other than his own in usually black and white terms. And yeah, unsurprisingly, after giving a decent overview of moral relativism, emphasizing two of its core components, and there are different variants of this, he does continue to strawman the relativist perspective pretty hard here. Starting with the classic move of acting as if its least defensible subtype represents the philosophy as a whole. First criticizing that moral relativists are defaulting to a view of mutual tolerance, which is still quite a common, albeit uncharitable point against it, but then going on to say that they are completely powerless to deal with intolerance of other groups. And even more extremely later saying that, quote, it balances the pain of the victim against the pleasure of the victimizer, the agony of the murdered child against the dark ecstasy of the fiend who murdered her. Ugh. But the crucial difference, of course, is moral relativists are not themselves swimming somewhere outside of those frameworks, unable to judge right from wrong. They still very much operate from within their own moral framework like the rest of us. Just that they also have this meta-ethical belief about the frame dependence of ultimate moral truth. That's why, again, 9/11 is so clumsy of an example here. Where you can make a decent point is maybe issues that happen inherently in a foreign culture and stay there, that relativism kind of leads people to be too accepting about it. But with a foreign group of extremists attacking innocent people in another country, by implications threatening the safety of many others, it just becomes so easy to see that any reasonable relativist is literally gonna have more or less the same full range of responses available as a moral absolutist would. Of course, there's more nuance to all of this, and I'm sure I'm still oversimplifying things here as well. But again, we have this situation where Chris Langan is just not interested in adequately exploring the position that he actually set himself out to criticize in the first place. When the balance of the text would just benefit so much from him engaging at least a little bit with the arguments from people like David Wong or Richard Rorty, or anyone who actually holds a morally relativistic position.
It isn't that we should abandon morality, we should adopt a morality and we should accept it, but realize it's not the only possible morality and it's not the single true morality.
Now, especially with this section, you could say to his defense that he is directionally right, or that he addresses it at the level of simplicity that his readers will understand. But in my estimation, he just makes it too easy for himself, too early convinced that he has it all figured out to explore further and become properly informative for the reader. But okay, let's hear him out. So Chris Langan is now trying to derive the ultimate and best morality from game theory. And this is where I think we can highlight what is maybe the most positive aspect in his writing. Because Chris, for all his flaws, is quite good at finding those niche fields of research that are just out of reach for the casual reader, but still readable or relevant enough that it may be of interest to them. Like with this game theory example, I didn't know before how it could be connected to morality. To be clear, game theory is not intrinsically about morality, it's about finding optimum equilibria in strategic situations. But if you take a game like The Prisoner's Dilemma and repeat it multiple times, what emerges as the optimal strategy for both players, with tit for tat, kind of resembles a base form of morality based on reciprocity and the willingness to cooperate. So people like Joshua Green can use it to cautiously illustrate characteristics that may exemplify why our moral intuitions may have evolved, which is still speculative, but it's interesting, right? And a topic well suited for a book like this. But of course, there's a reason why I veered into how another author writes about the topic, because while Chris Langan introduces it here, the issue again is how much he thinks he can derive from this, his overconfidence and associativeness in the way he approaches it. I'll spare you the details, but he basically goes into the theory of metagames, an even more technical and specific subfield in game theory. And then again, completely out of left field, he writes that, quote, "The theory of metagames can be reduced to a single general strategy, the golden rule." And from there, just acts like, okay, yup, we settled it. Golden rule is absolute morality now for cross-cultural issues. And I fact-checked this. If you look at the book and the claims of the author of the subfield, there's no suggestion whatsoever that this field was designed to comment about morality at all. I also asked 3 AIs about it. All of them pretty much say that this conclusion comes out of nowhere and accuse him of motivated reasoning. And I want to be appropriately harsh here because you see this pattern repeatedly throughout this book. Like, if you have someone in your personal life and you see them constantly grasping these loose analogies with absolute certainty and derive very idiosyncratic conclusions about it, your first assumption should not be, oh, he must be a genius. And that is regardless of how intelligent or successful they are in another domain. There's actually a number of quite common reasons why a person might be talking that way, especially in media communication. And pretty much none of them are that they are some kind of universal polymath able to endow original wisdom on a broad range of issues. So don't be like Malcolm Gladwell in his puff piece about Chris Langan, talking about how fast and eloquent he can speak as a signifier of intelligence in any relevant sense. But realize that some of those features we mentioned about eccentric thinking styles make it a whole lot easier to talk smoothly and sound clever, because these people can bend their sentences into becoming more like improvisational theater than science talk, without people necessarily noticing because of their overuse of technical language, right? But of course, those word salads they produce can still stimulate ideas or appear thought-provoking, right? Like, if you know what you're getting yourself into, this is all you should possibly hope from a Langan essay. This wild combination of ideas and science mumbo-jumbo that probably doesn't all fit together, strictly speaking, but that may jog your head a little bit with fancy ideas and can at least make you curious about exploring further. And this approach leads me to my next topic. So among people who genuinely like Langan, I can identify 2 groups here. One, I assume, is a segment of deeply religious people with maybe less of a formal educational background, who kind of got roped into giving Langan's credence because of how he seems to confirm their own deeply held religious beliefs. The other group, I think, is somewhat closer to the demographic of who might actually be watching this. while still more skeptical towards mainstream experts than your average person. These are people who have gotten curious by Langan's branding as a genius and are genuinely open for his ideas, but don't just naively accept them either. Instead, as I read in one comment under a Langan critical video, they simply pick and choose ideas from different places online and see if they can get something useful out of it without baselessly idealizing anybody. And I want to address that approach together with people like me who are reading it semi-ironically, but still hopeful to get something out of it. And talk a bit about why also for people like us, there's simply much better alternatives out there. Basically, it boils down to this. Langan simply seems to lack the self-awareness necessary for recognizing where the value of his ideas may be in comparison to other works around him, which in turn prevents him from playing up to those strengths that us critical readers may appreciate, and he can't help but muddle it up with his weaknesses that only serve to set up false expectations and misunderstandings about the topics he makes the reader curious about. And this lack of self-awareness in my mind is caused primarily by his narcissistic tendencies that I have mentioned a couple of times now, so I feel like I should substantiate them with another example before we look at how a better author could deal with some of these issues. So there's this website, Less Wrong, where some of those perhaps a bit too open-minded but still critically thinking people I have described seem to accumulate. In one article here, a person with a suitable level of academic background or expertise has gotten contracted to kind of review and summarize one of Chris's major papers. And you can tell it's done in good faith by its generally neutral tone and how it takes plenty of time to point at the positives, like stimulating ideas they feel it brings up and the whole ambitiousness of it. But it also has plenty criticisms, things that you shouldn't be surprised if you watched the video so far. Namely that his theory as a whole doesn't really seem to fit together and that it misrepresents and misuses a bunch of science terminology throughout. So the first comment underneath is from Chris Langan, and in just one comment he would say that firstly, his theory is the best theory, no one even comes close. Also, it's as clear as it can possibly be, and if you don't understand it, that's a skill issue on your side. And if you think you saw a mistake, the mistake is almost certainly yours. In fact, merely arguing with his theory amounts to undermining your own argument, whatever it may be. And as a cherry on top, without seemingly being prompted at all, he talks about how he could vastly outperform any of the tech billionaires if he only wanted to, and how he isn't taken serious in academia only because they're all brainwashed idiots who conspire against him. You see, very convenient, right? In any field where he hasn't achieved much, it's because either people are conspiring against him or it's simply not worthy of his attention and he could totally be the best if he just wanted to. So yeah, this doesn't exactly read like the thinking of a guy apt at accepting his own flaws and limitations, right? In fact, it displays exactly one of the issues associated with high levels of narcissism. This difficulty with accepting and learning from your own mistakes, which I think this well-meaning article could otherwise give him a good basis for. So it's a tendency that can only impact a non-fiction writer for the worse, because without that self-awareness, he now leaves to the usually non-expert reader the unlikely task of parsing out the decent from the completely misguided aspects of his work. So to wrap up this section, let's look at an example of how an author without those extremely obvious character flaws may balance some of those issues, namely Daniel Dennett and his book Intuition Pumps. Thematically, these books are actually remarkably similar. About free will, consciousness, it's pretty much all there. Also, their at times playful tone and the approach of creatively trying to combine insights from different academic fields make them suitable for comparison. But in terms of the standards they establish about their epistemology, the books really couldn't be more different. It's fascinating just how many of Langan's biases Dennett manages to anticipate and warn his readers against in just the first 2 chapters of his book. I guess he's a university professor who interacts with both students and hobbyists, so he must be familiar with these issues from various angles. Against motivated reasoning, for example, the leitmotif really of this video, Dennett warns in the very first paragraph of his introduction, talking about the stony path of truth competing with seductive, easier options. And later in the chapter, making clear that his own ideas should also not be treated as fixed points, but merely as worthy candidates for exploration. He also makes sure to clarify early on the distinction between philosophy and science, that in Langan's writings all too often uncritically blend into each other. And with regards to what we just talked about, Dennett's second chapter is all about the value of accepting mistakes. He talks about how especially students in competitive universities or people who have chips on their shoulder for other reasons can sometimes pride themselves in not making any mistakes, and that he often needs to encourage them to make these productive mistakes in order to learn and grow from it. Langan would have certainly benefited a lot if he had gotten such advice in his youth and had been able to take it to heart. Of course, in his own words, he had a very difficult upbringing with violence and a lack of tolerant role models like Dennett might be. And of course that plays a part in all of this that can't be brushed aside, while also not excusing elements of his worldview. So I'm with Dennett and wishing that we could in the future help people like Langan just realize that they don't have to act like they have it all figured out to create good or impactful and impressive work, especially not in philosophy. Like, we are smart enough to see through that and know that they haven't, right? But that if they were honest with themselves and, in Langan's case, approached his book with a bit more humility, that I think they could appeal to a much wider audience and gain respect from actual critical thinkers rather than needing to cater to ideologues who just want to see their dogmas confirmed by this paper-thin facade of an infallible genius. And this would be a good note to end on, but I want to finish reviewing this one because the ending is quite a thing to behold as well. So, after having rejected moral relativism, for the final conclusion, Chris Langan tries to tie it all back to the topic from the start of the 9/11 attacks. And I have to admit, after reading some of his earlier points, I was like, oh my god, please don't let your conclusion of this 10-page essay be that 9/11 was indeed bad. Please don't let that be your conclusion. Well, it's not that, but it's not much better either. So he says that with the golden rule, you can apply rational decision-making theory to the situation, which would suggest that, quote, influential and well-meaning Muslims should appoint a council of Islamic scholars to revise Muslim scripture and basically just get rid of all the controversial parts. Damn, how didn't we come up with that before? It's like, I don't like this passage about gays, so let's just change the Bible, everyone. Come on, get your Sharpies out, cross it out. Can't be that hard. I don't want to go too deep into this, but I guess, first of all, this is an incredibly naive suggestion. Like, I remember distinctly when I was like 14 and watched New Atheist for the first time. One of my first ideas was, why not just change the text then? Like, it doesn't take the golden rule, moral absolutism, or advanced level game theory to derive that idea. It's literally the most intuitive, naive, and unpolished idea that pops in your head when you first hear about the issue as an outsider. And of course, it's also just not realistic at all. Like, the Abrahamic religions tend to view their holy book as the word of God, the ultimate authority. Trying to change it would be, by definition, complete blasphemy. There's also no centralized body that could legitimately declare the Quran is now edited to 1.3 billion Muslims around the world. Like, it's just not feasible, bro, as nice as it sounds to the completely naive ear. Ironically, what might have helped Langan make a better suggestion here would be more of an attitude of cultural relativism. A bit different from moral relativism, it's a principle to try and understand practices and beliefs from within the standards of the other culture, rather than being stuck on your own. Because, as many anthropologists will argue, even if you want to make later on an intervention, valuing that approach can be more effective because it allows us to translate change into more locally meaningful and lasting terms, rather rather than imposing it purely from the outside. So, starting from Chris's suggestion, you could, in cooperation with insiders, identify certain subcultures where a campaign to de-emphasize or reinterpret these passages could be effective. Or, often better yet, if you found trusted partners in the other country, to design an intervention from the grounds up based on the needs and leverage point they identify. These are, of course, also not original suggestions at all, but would at least be more feasible versions of Langan's black and white proposal. But, of course, thinking in those directions does not fit with Chris Langan's MO. He prefers the oversimplified, grandiose ideas to more developed concepts that would require an actual understanding of the other side, which throughout the book he is unfortunately so vehemently and egocentrically avoiding. And that's the duality of Chris Langan and many cases like him. On the one hand, he is extremely open to incorporate all those ideas from different scientific subfields in often questionable ways into his thinking. And on the other hand, he's obviously just all too happy to stop his investigation when reaching this intuitive conclusion, fed to him not by the objectivity of this supposedly incredible intellect, but from the zeitgeist of the extremist right-wing beliefs he's really operating from. So, because of its pop philosophy tone, I started out weary that I might actually enjoy this book. But for the essays I've read so far, I didn't need to wrestle with the conundrum of having to give this guy too many compliments. The reasoning is just too shoddy, even for a book like this. And of course, I don't connect with the worldview either, which would make me naturally more charitable to look past some of this stuff. Unsurprisingly, with his many contradictions, Langan's work has been ridiculed by many within the skeptical niche, and deservedly so. But like with the flat earthers and harder cases of conspiratorial thought, it all gets quite depressing the longer you think about it. Of course, this thinking does not come from nowhere. It's his upbringing, its personality and mental health. Factors mostly outside of our control, no matter how hard we want to believe in the metaphysical basis of free will. But of course, if you're like me and fascinated by these types of stories, it's also important not to get too hung up on these rare extremes, except to the extent that we can still derive some insight and entertainment from it. Like, I think I'm still learning a lot about the limitations of general factor intelligence and the types of cognitive structures that limit the positive impact it can have on real-world issues. Also, people like this commenter are interesting to hear about, talking about how having had a very high IQ score needlessly messed with their self-perception for a while, until, quote, life straightened them out again, making for a very fitting example of the idea of fixed and growth mindsets. Of course, what we see with cases like Eric Weinstein or Chris Langan is that aside from their unique overconfidence, they seem to have insulated themselves from feedback and expert opinion while working on the early stages of their grand theories. Then they come out years later with that complex, calcified thing with a huge amount of ego attached to it that leads them to assume that anyone who criticizes it just hasn't understood it properly, right? Combine those narcissistic defense mechanisms with the anti-institutional bias of not paying particular regard to experts either, and where are the guardrails left to straighten them out like the commenter experienced it, right? Of course, there's always going to be cases like this. And maybe the best we can do right now as a society is to continue cleaning up a bit with this Goodwill Hunting style genius myth. Improve on the stories of these lone, eccentric geniuses that have worked mainly in fiction or artistic scenarios, and try to portray more realistic pictures of how progress in some of these modern, already well-developed fields actually happens, so that perhaps a few more people with these very strong ego-driven motives will attach their efforts to more promising avenues, and that we may see a few less comments pushing back against Langan criticisms with takes like, if you don't have his IQ, then you can't really criticize him. When instead of IQ scores, these people should probably be looking at terms like falsifiability, confirmation bias, and a whole host of cognitive and emotional factors that can so easily override raw intelligence, equal the playing field, and determine whose claims actually manage to make contact with reality. Before we go into the equally as good bonus content, thank you for watching the video so far. Consider leaving a like or subscribe, especially as a small channel, it would really help out. Also, as a small commercial, having completed the coaching classes in my psychology masters, I'm starting to offer some psychological coaching grounded in the evidence-based approaches we have practiced, so no Freudian-inspired BS. But what I can offer related to my background in philosophy as well is to work with you on developing and testing your philosophical worldview and see if there's a way to tie those beliefs and values into your practical life as well. I will show on screen the approaches that I'm most familiar with, so you see a bit where I'm coming from on this. But that's for people who want the fancy schmancy. The core of my coaching is really the psychological approaches, getting you unstuck, organized, and work with you on personality, social, and career goals of your choice. So if you're in the market for that, you can hit me up in the email in the description. I'm still able to offer some pretty affordable prices, so check it out if you're interested. My favorite comment under any of the Langan videos is actually not one of the often very poignant critical ones, but it's under this edit of Langan talking about the meaning of life in his usual abstract and grievance-ridden ways. And it's from this guy who simply opens up and shares a bit of his life story. He goes, "Man, when I was younger, I spent so much time trying to figure out the meaning of life. I wrote down theories, dreams, and déjà vu moments. I thought I was special and important. I was such a dreamer, man." And when someone asked if he concluded that life was meaningless, he continues, "Well, at the time I felt a bit that way. I'm now 28, married with children, and I will tell you that the life I created means everything to me. Kids, family really are the meaning of life, watching the cycle of growing up happen all over again, this time as a parent." And it's so beautifully simple and down to earth, especially in juxtaposition with how Chris Langan tends to talk about things. Not being able to help himself from ranting against banksters, atheists, or academics on the side.
By the way, these new atheists, I mean, they're adamant. None of them will mention my name now, though, because they know that they can be crushed. Deep down inside, they know they won't come anywhere near me. These people decided that they had to exclude anybody who could beat them. That's where the cancellation thing began, really.
As much as I like philosophy, it really goes to show that questions like the meaning of life or ultimate morality are really only as complicated as you want them to be. It's like we are beings who feel things, living on a planet with other beings who also feel things. So how about we try to find meaning in improving others' well-being and from engaging in arts, sports, reading, social life or other activities we find fulfilling. And if that doesn't work in times of struggle, we can perhaps fall back on taking pride in developing a tough, resilient personality that can weather the storms life throws at us. You see, it's not rocket science, right? On the other hand, there are also a lot of people who write that they have gotten a lot of meaning out of Chris's discussion of the CTMU, his major theory. Particular people with deep-seated spiritual question and a heightened need for cognitive closure, perhaps. And to those people, I hope I'm not coming across as someone who wants to completely dismiss their experience and say that it's all bad or stupid or something. I don't think it is. I've looked a bit into the CTMU as well, and some of the essays I presented are also tangentially related to it. And from what I read about it, there are genuinely decent philosophical concepts in it. So there's no shame in getting meaning out of it. In fact, that's where my ethos may differ a bit from others in the skeptical niche. Like, if you're passionate about this abstract philosophical worldview, even Jungian archetypes or New Age stuff like that, I think that can be, in principle, a good thing, where you can derive creativity and motivation from, as long as you're still able to tie it in with empirical reality. Of course, it becomes iffy if you assume to have found absolute truth in such a fuzzy domain and think everyone else should also be into the same thing. That's one of the issues I see in the CTMU, as you may have already guessed. But the other core issue I want to address for now is not in the ideas themselves, but in the way he packages them. Many of his ideas, it has been pointed out, are incredibly similar to other ideas in philosophy. And instead of doing the diligent work of trying to align his terminology with how others in the field have talked in order to be able to have fruitful discussions about it, he constantly introduces new terminology and mixes in terms from other disciplines, a practice which, in my and some experts' opinions, just serve to needlessly obfuscate sometimes very trivial statements.
You're assigning or distributing properties to nature, and then nature is instantiating the properties. Am I right?
If you want to speak the language of mathematics, you can speak that way. I'm not sure how helpful it is Why do we speak of instances if there is only one thing? I don't think this language is helpful at all. It's obscurantism.
And I could say so much about all this, but for now, I'll just say that with all I've learned about him, it's hard for me not to psychologize Langan's language use as just another symptom of his narcissistic tendencies. If you invent your own idiosyncratic terms, it becomes easy to get this sense of superiority over people, a core drive of narcissism, making others feel like you have the special knowledge you can endow on them. And it also makes it very easy to avoid criticism, another classic narcissistic driver, as even if an expert criticizes it, you can go, yeah, that point is correct, but the way I define it, I mean something slightly different here. And that is the move that Langan uses again and again when confronted with criticism. For example, in the review I showed earlier from the author with a master's in computer science, she points out that the CTMU doesn't work computationally. Well, it's not a computational system, it's a proto-computational system. She says it fails the grammar test for formal languages. Well, it's not a formal system, it's a meta-formal system. In another review, this mathematician criticizes Langan's use of set theoretical concepts and points out that naive set theory has been proven to be unsound to begin with. Langan's response, well, I'm not using set in the sense of set theory. I'm using it in a more general sense. Well, okay, but then why are you borrowing all those bulky terms from other domains if they don't really fit with what you want to say after all and you have to change them up anyway? That's one of the questions I have for CTMU supporters. Like, maybe it helps him to use these analogies to think in new directions and stimulate his creativity. Like, that's fine. But then why doesn't he put the effort in to translate the terms back into a recognized shareable form, either that of general systems theory or one commonly used in philosophy and metaphysics, to reduce all these misunderstandings he is getting? Because then when he talks to someone with a PhD in philosophy and expertise in metaphysics, the discipline that the CTMU ultimately belongs in, someone who really should be able to follow along with what Langan is trying to say, he seems to have no clue what Langan is talking about either.
You seem to be saying the universe is meta-deterministic or super deterministic.
I don't know what you mean by that, so I cannot say yes or no, but maybe.
So I call it a super tautology. It's not.
I don't know why you're saying this. I don't know what you're talking about, to be honest. I don't know what you're talking about. Instances of itself. Why do we speak of instances if there is only one thing? I don't think this language is helpful at all. It's obscurantism.
You're assigning or distributing properties to nature, and then nature is instantiating the properties. Am I right?
There is nothing new in this. This stuff has been put forward by many people for thousands of years. I think there is a perfectly good word in history called idealism. So why will I use another word? It's my very best effort to not come up with new words, but to stick to old words so people know that I'm not saying anything new at all here.
Okay, can I ask a question?